Tonight, the world watches a widening confrontation that has moved from diplomatic backrooms to the narrow strategic waters of the Strait of Hormuz. At the center of this moment is a single objective: to choke the flow of revenue that sustains an adversary and to force decisions that might alter the calculus of war. The president has publicly signaled that talks with Tehran could resume almost immediately, even as military and economic pressure remain at the forefront of U.S. strategy. He urged Iran to present a unified proposal and made clear that Washington is not operating under a strict timetable. He said he is under no time pressure for an agreement and reiterated that the blockade in the Strait will remain in place while negotiations, if they happen, continue to be evaluated against U.S. objectives. That posture is consequential. On one hand, it leaves the door open to diplomacy. On the other, it keeps the instruments of coercion firmly in play. The president emphasized that the blockade is intended to deprive Iran of oil revenue, a central leverage point in a long campaign to limit Tehran's ability to fund proxy networks, build weapon systems, and sustain its military posture. The strategy is blunt and transactional. Stop the oil and you constrict the state's war-fighting budget. But that tactic carries risks too. The more pressure is applied at sea, the greater the chance of miscalculation, a skirmish that could escalate into a broader confrontation. In the last week, tensions turned kinetic. Iranian forces reportedly opened fire on 3 commercial vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz, and Iranian state media claimed 2 ships were seized. U.S. military officials have been closely monitoring the situation. Central Command says coalition and American forces have repeatedly intervened to reroute or protect merchant shipping, directing dozens of vessels to turn around or return to port since the blockade began. The Pentagon also alleged a longer-term danger. Clearing naval mines and restoring secure navigation lanes could take months. One official assessment put the timeline to neutralize Iran's seaborne mine threat at up to 6 months, a sobering reminder that maritime pressure is not a quick surgical fix, but a protracted, resource-intensive campaign. On Capitol Hill and on camera, lawmakers are debating both the strategy and the resources required to sustain it. Representative Carlos Giménez of Florida, a member of the House Armed Services Committee, framed the situation in stark terms. "We can start kinetic strikes anytime we want," he said, underscoring the fact that the U.S. retains a full range of military options. Yet he argued that the blockade itself may be hurting Iran now more than the kinetic strikes we had in the past, and urged continued pressure to ensure Iran cannot recover and regroup. For Gimenez, the endgame is clear: degrade Iran's capacity to wage war and ensure it never develops a weapon-usable nuclear capability. We need all the nuclear material. We need to make sure the Strait of Hormuz is opened and also remains open in the future, he said, adding that there must be an ability to absolutely verify that Iran will not pursue a nuclear weapon going forward. These are aims that resonate across national security circles. Control of the sea lanes and verification of nuclear restraint are classic instruments of statecraft, but achieving them is expensive in blood, treasure, and diplomatic capital. The conversation about resources quickly pivots to the Pentagon's bottom line. Earlier this year, the White House proposed a sweeping defense request that has been characterized in different ways by different players. The president framed an ambitious figure. Some members of Congress have suggested the realistic allocation may be lower. Gimenez, speaking from his position on the Armed Services Committee, said more must be spent to counter the so-called pacing threat of the 21st century, China. Our pacing threat is actually China, he said, and emphasized the need to make sure that Beijing never comes alongside or overtakes us. Whether that requires the full sum the administration seeks, he added, remains to be negotiated, but in his view, the strategic imperative is unambiguous. Invest more in defense to stay ahead. The calculus of competition with China is now being seen through the lens of the Iran confrontation. In the interview, Gimenez suggested that moves against Iran and Venezuela are sending a message that could give Washington leverage in other theaters. "We can choke off China's oil just any time that we want," he said. He pointed to Venezuela's energy resources, which he said are under U.S. control, and Iran's oil flows, arguing that both are levers that could be used in broader strategic competition. He went further, naming energy and food security as 2 vulnerabilities for China that could be exploited through naval and economic pressure. It is a blunt argument: demonstrate capacity and will in one theater, and you change adversary calculations elsewhere. Those remarks tie into a string of aggressive cross-regional policies that the administration has pursued in recent months. Washington has taken an especially hard line on Cuba, opening diplomatic contacts and pressing Havana for rapid reforms. A U.S. delegation recently met with Cuban officials in Havana to discuss changes to the island's state-led economy and to offer technical assistance to restore internet service, including the possibility of satellite-based systems. The delegation was led by senior administration officials, and the trip signaled an escalation in diplomatic outreach that many U.S. policymakers view as a rare opportunity. Cuba is undergoing a severe economic and political stress test, and Washington is pressing for conditions that include greater connectivity and political liberties. That outreach coincided with the release of a large number of prisoners by Cuban authorities. Reported numbers exceed 2,000 and prompted debates in Washington about the right mix of pressure and engagement. Representative Gimenez welcomed the focus on Cuba's internal dynamics, but warned against unrealistic expectations. He emphasized that regimes like Cuba's and Iran's often respond to instability by clamping down on communications and protests. They're never going to allow Starlink, he said, referring to commercial satellite internet services that can bypass state-controlled infrastructure. One of the first things these regimes do, including Iran, is they shut down the internet so the people, the dissidents inside, cannot communicate. His point was direct. Technical solutions to bypass censorship can be part of a strategy, but autocratic regimes often take preemptive steps to deny their populations those channels beyond geopolitics and technology. Washington's domestic machinery is strained. The federal government this week neutered an extended funding impasse that has now dragged into a prolonged lapse in regular appropriations. Lawmakers in both chambers are wrestling with how to resolve immediate funding shortfalls, with the Department of Homeland Security and Border Enforcement agencies among the most contested line items. The Senate recently approved funding in a narrow vote in the early hours of the morning, but that step is only the beginning of a larger budget fight that will determine whether border security agencies receive money through the fall or are left to the fraught dynamics of continuing resolutions and political leverage. Congressman Gimenez outlined a contingency plan favored by many in his caucus. Pass normal appropriations bills that exclude immigration and customs enforcement and customs and border protection, and then fund those agencies through reconciliation so that funding would be locked in for the administration's term and not subject to future shutdown brinksmanship. We'll pass SSA normal appropriations bill that excludes ICE and Customs and Border Protection, and will pass a reconciliation that includes ICE and Customs and Border Protection and funds it throughout the term of the administration, he said. The approach is intended to take funding for these agencies off the table as a political weapon, yet it is also a highly partisan strategy that, if pursued, would deepen distrust and likely trigger procedural fights in the House and Senate. If the current gap is not closed quickly, the consequences will ripple into national security. The Department of Homeland Security, Gimenez noted, is in the middle of a crisis while the United States contends with an active maritime and diplomatic confrontation. Funding shortfalls, he warned, would hamper the government's ability to sustain operations at sea, to process and manage the flow of migrants, and to invest in technologies that secure ports and critical infrastructure. We can't have them hold the entire depart. Chemit hostage because of their crazy stance on ICE and customs. He said, speaking bluntly about political opponents, the language is sharp, so too are the stakes. This fight over funding also intersects with the larger fiscal debate unfolding in Washington, reconciling robust defense spending with growing domestic priorities. Gimenez suggested a path forward that blends normal appropriations with reconciliation measures aimed at delivering tangible benefits to Americans, improving affordability, reducing burdens on taxpayers, and shoring up defense. For me, yes, I think we can and we should pass those things that we all agree on, he said, while acknowledging that factions on the margins can complicate the process. The legislative timetable, he noted, is tight. Congress must navigate domestic priorities, looming elections, and an increasingly fluid international security environment at sea. The immediate tactical challenge is to maintain freedom of navigation while minimizing escalation. The U.S. and its partners face the dual task of keeping commercial traffic moving and neutralizing Iran's capacity to interdict shipping, a job that means mine clearing, convoying, enhanced surveillance, and readiness to respond to interdiction attempts. The Pentagon has been explicit about the heavy lift ahead. Neutralizing seabed and floating mines is painstaking and dangerous work, requiring specialized platforms, divers, and time. Even with robust resources, the timeline to clear the most threatened lanes will not be measured in days. The strategic picture that emerges is one of interconnected pressure points. Economic sanctions and naval blockades aim to squeeze an adversary's revenue. Diplomatic engagement and clandestine talks offer a pathway to de-escalation if concessions can be verified. And defense spending is being recalibrated to ensure the United States can sustain global commitments while competing with peer rivals. At each pivot, lawmakers and administration Officials are balancing risk and reward, urgency and patience for millions of people, seafarers, traders, families in the Middle East and beyond. The unfolding developments translate into higher freight costs, disrupted supply chains, and the ever-present prospect of escalation. For policymakers in Washington, they represent a test of credibility. Can the United States impose pressure without sparking a wider war? Can diplomacy be leveraged while coercive tools remain credible? And can the American political system reconcile the fiscal demands of defense with domestic priorities, all while avoiding self-inflicted crises at home that would undermine operations abroad? Representative Gimenez closed his comments with an urgency that echoed throughout the conversation. Iran must be denied the capacity to wage war and to pursue a nuclear capability. The Strait must be kept open, and verification mechanisms must be ironclad. Those are the goals, he said, that at least we have to have before these hostilities cease. It is a succinct encapsulation of a strategy heavy on conditions. Pressure until verifiable change is achieved. As this situation continues to develop, the world will be watching how Washington balances coercion and concession, how allies respond to requests for shared burden, and how adversaries adapt to a campaign aimed at severing their economic lifelines. For now, the Strait of Hormuz remains a flashpoint, narrow, vital, and symbolic of the broader contest playing out on multiple contents. The months ahead will test the patience of negotiators, the readiness of militaries, and the resilience of a global system that depends on the free flow of energy and goods. The question for leaders at home and abroad is simple and stark. Will the instruments now in motion produce a lasting resolution, or will they draw more actors into a spiraling confrontation that no one wants but everyone fears?